I'm GM right now, and I can say that I think every tank player would trade having their damage output cut in half if it meant actually feeling tanky. Endless Orbit, I don't think that would be true, actually. And the reason it wouldn't be true is the end result of that is all the tanks will be significantly weaker, would be my guess. And here's why. Here's what would happen. We would cut the tank's damage in half, which means they need to be tankier, and they need to have more crowd control and utility. Okay, so now think about what it means to be a tank. You have lots of crowd control, you never die, and you can't kill anyone, right? Like that's the extreme version of this. A character like that, outside of the support role, is very, very, very powerful for professional players. Because they're the ones that can coordinate around a character like that. They're the ones who can say, oh, you're tanky, and you have CC, but you can't do anything by yourself, because remember, you don't have any damage. Because remember, it doesn't matter if you CC someone if they don't, like, receive problems after being CC'd, right? Like, if I'm a tank, and I go in and CC my opponent, and I don't do any damage to them, they just turn around and kill me, or they walk away, right? I could CC them for 10 seconds, and maybe that's good if like things are happening across the map, but like if there's no follow-up, right, then that CC doesn't matter nearly as much. Again, assuming things like, oh, I'm CCing him so he doesn't run to Baron and smite it, or something like that, right? And so I think the end result of that is you make a class of characters that's very, very strong for pros, while at the same time feeling fairly unsatisfying for the average player, because I'm not convinced that a tank player would enjoy like being in a state where they're entirely reliant on their teammates to like follow up on their engage to get anything done. I don't know if the AugustUwU player or the Zac player would enjoy nearly as much like jumping into a team fight, CCing the enemy team, and then being like, okay, I've done my job, now I hope my teammates show up. Like, they want some degree of agency there. It doesn't mean they should be like one-shot burst people, right? But like, there's some important part of I have some threat of my own. And so I think the end result of your suggestion is tanks become much more balanced around pro, feel much weaker for the average player, and honestly feel a lot less satisfying in the average case, because there'd be so many instances in a game where a tank goes in, tries to fight, does everything he did correctly, but is completely reliant on teammates in a sloppy game that your teammates don't follow up on you and then ping you with the question mark when you die. Right? So I'm not sure that makes the game better or makes tank players happier in the long run. We saw this, by the way. The reason I'm saying this is that we saw this with the tank update. That was our strategy on the tank update. The tank update that we did years ago was tanks should do less damage and have more CC and be more utility based. And the end result of it was exactly what I'm describing. Tanks became a lot less satisfying for the average players to play, especially after we ended up balancing them for pro play, because they had to be balanced and tuned around a meta that highly, highly values a character on a team who never dies and is really good at CC and then relies on their teammates for follow-up. All that said, if I was to talk about tanks actually feeling tanky, here's the way I would describe how I think tanks should feel tanky, because I think feeling tanky, I'm not trying to discount that's a very important fantasy for a tank player. Like, if a tank player doesn't feel tanky, they are genuinely losing out on something they like about their character. And that's lame. I agree with you. Tank character players should feel tanky. The way I think about tank players and how they should feel tanky, though, is that tanks, I do not think, in the average game, doesn't mean all games, in the average game, have the right to be tanky versus everyone at every time. I think how a tank is supposed to work is they're supposed to choose who they get to be tanky against. And so, as an example, let's say you're a tank and you're bunched against the physical damage characters. You're like, oh, okay, I don't want to die to them. And so you build Thornmail, you build Frozen Heart, you build Randuin's, whatever, and then those characters can't kill you and you feel very tanky to them. But then the mage comes along and your life gets a little harder, right? Similarly, if you're a tank and you are playing against a Teemo in lane, and you're like, okay, I want to rush a Spirit Visage. I don't know if that's actually good, by the way, but like, this is my hypothetical world. And so you're like, I'm going to rush a Spirit Visage, and that means I can't die to this Teemo. Pog, I win. And then, we run to the AD carry and you have troubles there, right? And so I think, personally, the ideal way to make tanks tanky, which I think is the more balanced and also more fun for a lot of tanks, to be honest, is they choose the people they get to, I'd say, screw over. They were like, oh, I have to deal with that person, so I'm going to buy the items that make that person have a hard time against me. But then buying that will come with some sort of trade-off, right? It'll come with, oh, well, if I'm really, really, really focused on making that AD carry not be able to interact with me, then, you know, probably means the mage has a better time or something like that. And so generally agree that tanks should feel tanky. I don't necessarily agree that they should be in the average game. Doesn't mean all games. Universally tanky against everyone all the time. I think they are supposed to have like ups and downs to their tankiness profile. And based on their decision in the item system, have characters that they just really destroy and other characters that they might have a harder time against. That's my personal opinion on tanks. Why do tanks deal so much damage? They need to deal some amount of damage to have A, personal agency, and B, have threat. I've talked about it a number of times on stream, but it doesn't matter if you're invincible if you don't have threat. And the threat can either come from utility, like CCing people, and come from personal damage. So I'm of the very strong opinion that tanks having personal damage is very important for the game, because it means that you can't just walk past a tank if you have 10 health. You have to consider them. You have to consider their body in the space of the game and know that that's a dangerous proposition for you. And I think that's important, even if the tank doesn't have a teammate to follow up on their CC. Now, whenever I say this, I always have to like add the caveat. There's a difference between a tank being able to kill you and a tank one-shotting you, right? Should a tank be an assassin? Probably not, right? But there's a huge difference between I killed you from full in 2 seconds and I killed you from full over 10 seconds. 10 seconds is an eternity in League of Legends. So I personally do not have an issue with certain tanks, with certain items, at certain game states, being able to say, hey, if I'm stuck on you long enough, you eventually die, right? I think that's okay. I don't think that's a bad thing. I do think it's a bad thing if they're just one-shotting you, right? Like we've definitely had metas where it's like, oh, I'm the AD carry and Leona solos me full to 0 in like 3 seconds. And it's like, oh, okay, yay, right? But if you're having problems with the tank and you're like, they killed me from full, but the killing you from full was over 10 seconds, it's like, well, if you can't kill that tank, they probably eventually kill you, and that's where your teammates come in, right? The assumption then would be, it's like, because remember, tank defenses, they don't necessarily scale perfectly to a 5v5 team fight, right? Like, a tank is probably going to be a lot more tanky against a single player than they are against, 5 players at once. And so one of the ways you probably are supposed to deal with a tank if they're getting into I'm insanely tanky 1v1 town is have some teammates to augment your damage. Preferably a teammate that has damage of the type that they didn't build against.